You're all very welcome. This is the second in a series of seminars hosted by UCD Research Partners team within UCD Research and Innovation. And the purpose of the overall series and the purpose of this session here is to showcase ongoing COVID-19 related research at UCD and, very importantly, across all discipline areas. The purpose also is to help facilitate greater interdisciplinary collaborations within UCD and also outside of UCD. And I'm very happy to see a number of participants who've joined us from outside of the university today, and you're very welcome. The seminar series takes place via Zoom at 2 p.m. every Wednesday. We had our first series seminar last week, and this is a program that's going to run up until the Christmas time, and each session lasts for just 30 minutes. So today's guest speaker is Dr. Claas Kirchhelle, a lecturer in the history of medicine within the UCD School of History under a Wellcome Trust University Award. Claas is also a Martin Fellow from the Oxford Martin School within the University of Oxford. So today's session will take the form of a conversation with Claas before taking a few questions from the people who have joined us as participants. And so I really ask you and encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And then we'll just leave a few minutes towards the end of the session to hopefully address a couple of those questions, even if they are quick fire. So hopefully get to a couple of those. So Claas's work focuses on understanding the medium and long-term biological and social factors underpinning the international spread and control of infectious disease. In November 2019, Claas was awarded a Wellcome Trust University Award at UCD to analyse the origins, historical path dependencies, and blind spots of global infectious disease control. And this award obviously could not have been more timely, given Claas's perspective that, and I quote from Claas here, COVID-19 has laid bare the need for urgent reforms in existing surveillance, but has also highlighted ways of moving beyond previous impasses, end quote. In this aspect of Claas's work, he has exposed significant differences in public health systems' ability to mount effective test and trace responses. Claas has conducted research on the history of antibiotic use, resistance and regulation, as well as focusing on how the history of vaccine development, trials and rollouts can be used to inform upcoming COVID-19 vaccine development and production and rollout. And it's these dual aspects of both surveillance and vaccine development and rollout that are the focus of our conversation today. At UCD, Claas has recently launched a new discovery module on contagion and control, humans, disease and environment since 1800 with Steve Gordon, Catherine Cox and Thilo Kroll. And that really underpins Claas's multidisciplinary approach to his work. And Claas recently published Ferric Progress, Antibiotics and Anglo-American Food Production from 1949 to 2019, just this January. And this is available from Rutgers University Press or as for free as a welcome open access monograph on the NCBI bookshelf. And this book won this year's Turiano Prize for the best early career book on the history of technology. And then finally, Claas's research on the past, present and future of antibiotics and stewardship has been shortlisted just very recently in the research category of Public Health England 2020 Antibiotic Guardian category. So Claas, you're very, very welcome, and thanks very much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great stuff. I want to begin actually with a broad question. And so obviously much of the public discourse on COVID-19 is centered around medical aspects to what is, of course, a public health emergency. So the response has been focused on obviously causes and effects, symptoms, contagion and aspects of vaccine development, the clinical trials and the development and rollout of vaccine programs. And perhaps quite rightly so, health sciences are at the center of that response, both locally and globally. But with this broad question that I would like to begin with is the role of the historian. And I respectfully say that it might be a surprise for some people to find a historian whose work is so focused on what is actually a very, very real present day crisis. So my question is, what role does the historian play in finding perhaps solutions to the present crisis? And then a connected question, how is humanities research relevant to this kind of challenge?
I mean, I think those are two really important questions. I think for historians in general and humanities researchers, there is quite a large part to play in thinking about global health, responses to disease, etc., because you have to think of a disease, any disease, not just COVID-19, as having both biological and social components. So we're not just speaking about a pathogen that's spreading, we're also speaking about social responses to it, in some cases facilitating the spread of a disease, in other cases stopping it from spreading. And this expertise on the social component of disease is something obviously that the humanities and social sciences are really good at. History in particular, I think, can provide interesting perspectives, and also I would go so far as to say perhaps, useful policy responses when we work together with other disciplines, because we bring to the table a long-term perspective on structural drivers of disease, the structural conditions that allow specific conditions to thrive. And at the same time, we can also focus quite specifically on specific technology platforms. So for example, in my own work on antibiotics, one of the big things affecting antimicrobial resistance at the moment are long-term trajectories of marketization, long-term healthcare systems, dependencies on cheap drugs, etc. And historians are quite well placed, I think, to bring to the table a very complex analysis, which I think might make solutions more robust and sustainable in the long term.
Very good. Is there a kind of a unified methodology, or is it different for different approaches?
So I think every social science has quite a distinct approach to tackling social issues. Some are more, for example, quantitative, others are more qualitative. And within history, there's also a broad range of methodologies that you can apply to similar issues. In my own case, I often tend to take on quite a qualitative approach. It doesn't mean that I shy away from quantification of specific things, but it really depends on the material and on the question that you're asking. And usually researchers in the humanities and social sciences can draw from a broad portfolio, kind of broad toolkit of methodologies that you then tailor to fit the specific question you're asking.
When you're attending, international conferences or working with colleagues on publications and things like that, do you find a resistance to humanities research approaches to topics like this within, as I mentioned earlier, on health sciences? Or do you find that that's something that's rapidly changing over the last number of years?
And to be honest, my experience has always been extremely positive. I've frequently found myself at congresses where I'm the only humanities person in a room of 600 people, and you give the presentation and then you first make the joke about, I'm the historian here. Why on earth did you invite me? But in general, you really do encounter genuine interest in tackling issues that are a bit more complex, a bit more out of the usual when it comes to analyzing both the past of the discipline itself, but also the past of the problem. So in my work with typhoid, I've been to lots of different conferences with microbiologists around the world, and there's a profound appreciation of the social constituents of disease, and also the need, I think, once people start appreciating, for example, the need for epidemiologically sophisticated analyses of specific situations, they're also quite open actually to historical explanations and to historical narratives that they frequently use themselves too.
I want to focus a little bit more specifically on particular work that you've carried out, but given that we're on the topic, and given that, in UCD research and in the research partners team, we're constantly trying to promote interdisciplinarity. But I'm interested also from a humanities perspective, like what are the biggest challenges? Is it something practical, like a lack of funding mechanisms to support these kinds of interdisciplinary discussions? Or is it something different? Is it language, where you're working with researchers from outside of your discipline and them with you too? Like, what are the significant stumbling blocks, and how might we think systematically of overcoming those?
I think for me, the biggest stumbling block I've encountered so far is lack of time to fully engage with each other's positions when it comes to tackling an issue. Before coming to UCD, I worked in an interdisciplinary think tank, for want of a better word, which was the Mountain School. And we bashed our heads in for, I think, a year with different disciplines, thinking about global health issues, etc., before we started to come to appreciate each other's expertise. I mean, we all appreciated each other's as experts in specific areas, but I think it took a while for us to realize that this approach could be complemented with another approach. So just having the time, I think, to meet regularly and form, to come to an appreciation of different approaches and how they might fit and form a kind of complex interdisciplinary jigsaw puzzle. That was the resource that we had there, and that is sometimes the resource that I think is lacking with some of the more general interdisciplinary research calls, where you get a bit of a budget for one conference and then suddenly you're supposed to come up with a genius interdisciplinary research, and it takes more time than that. It really takes time to get to know the other person and then to trust that person's expertise as a complement to your own.
And that makes sense in terms of even, putting together interdisciplinary research funding bids. We've definitely seen that the ones that tend to go the furthest and be successful are ones that are built on legitimate relationships, where the people really fully know each other on a personal and a professional level, and that somehow comes through in the way that the research proposal hangs together. It seems to make much more sense when those relationships exist.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, clearly you need the initial funding pots to establish those meetings. You have to have topic focused, I think, funding calls, which bring together lots of different disciplines, but you need to have the continued funding after that forces people to come together again and regularly discuss findings. I think that probably makes the biggest difference in the long term.
Very good. A significant aspect of your work and recent aspect of your work in terms of some publications that you've had is on the comparative analysis of health systems and their ability to test and trace, which of course is such an important and topical discussion just at the moment. Can you begin just by telling us a little bit more about that work that you've recently published on?
Yeah, so the Wellcome Trust University Award was awarded for a project that was supposed to assess the historical trajectories of global infectious disease surveillance. So it was, to my great surprise, that within a couple of months of being awarded it, we had a global pandemic that really stressed the system to its absolute limits. And that through, obviously the pandemic has thrown up a couple of issues just in terms of getting access to archives, etc. But it really did expose differences in performance, and very interesting differences in performance, specifically between high-income countries. And I, for historical and personal reasons, have always been quite interested in performance when we look at Europe and North America, between the US, Britain, and Germany. And remarkably, the German health system, which I personally would also not have predicted in 2019, outperformed both Anglo-American systems, which had just been ranked as top in the world for pandemic preparedness by, for example, a Johns Hopkins-led studies by the World Bank, etc. And
these rankings were prior to COVID-19.
These rankings were just 1 or 2 months prior to COVID-19, they were published, and they all got it wrong. And that raises not just an interesting political question, but it also raises a really interesting historical question about the metrics that we use to evaluate preparedness, and also the robustness of the underlying systems that we're relying on. And so for me, that led to a kind of gear change in the research that I was trying to conduct, where I then said, okay, well, we should have a detailed historical analysis of the reasons underlying this different performance. And together with colleagues, many of them have helped me along the way, there's now a preprint out that's under peer review, but also a Lancet microbe commentary, where we looked at the underlying reasons for this different performance. And what we found was that we called this piece Giants on Clay Feet. So behind this image of the CDC and Public Health England specifically as two of the leading global public health agencies, there's actually a hinterland of public health capacity that's been eroded, both in terms of political economy and resources since the 1970s. And hello, Justin, are we still recording or?
Sorry, Claas, you just definitely froze for me, but I don't know if that is my issue or yours, but please, I see you now and I hear you, so please continue.
A storm over the Irish Sea, who knows? But yeah, so anyway, so I was really intrigued by this, and what we found was this erosion of resources and autonomy in both the British and CDC case since the 1970s. And at the same time, in Germany, a very distinct development of public health since this period, where a very decentralized bottom-up system was given both the resources and degree of integration that was necessary to not be overwhelmed by the amount of samples that were hitting the system during the pandemic. It also, I think, led to an appreciation in the political commentary that it's pretty pointless at the moment to have these discussions where we are trying to transfer one system onto another system, because they've all evolved organically in different contexts, but really to lay bare the issue that specifically in the US and in the UK, we've had a long-term erosion of public health capacity at the local level.
Okay.
And that has not been adequately compensated for by the growth of IT system and genomics, which from the 1990s onwards were always praised as this alternative. Local public health capacity, and also the limits of privatization in this context, which has been, I think, a problematic force for large parts of the US public health establishment since the 1990s. So that was really just laying bare these structural long-term trends that go beyond immediate political explanations for highlighting this different performance. And to kind of end a very long answer, the last thing we then did was look at who was actually writing these public health analyses in 2019. And we found that teams consisting mostly of American researchers assessing American global health systems end up reifying American analyses of the status quo. So that there's also a need for a greater diversity of disciplinary and national viewpoints when it comes to quantifying metrics for global health.
That's really interesting. And like, I understand this sort of self-assessment that was carried out in order to congratulate themselves almost on the benefits of the system. But, you know, were there historians involved in that kind of analysis, or was it more short-term snapshot of a current system and talking about its merits on that basis? I mean, had they taken the historical view of things in order to assess the merits and flaws?
I mean, I don't want to pretend that historians would have come up with better answers in 2019. Right? A historian always has the benefit of hindsight. So, you know, that makes us sound very, how should I say, smug when it comes to retrospectively analyzing these things. So I'm not sure whether having an historian on board would have changed things. I think what would have definitely changed things would have been to have, in general, more humanities and social sciences researchers from outside of the global north. To really showcase how public health works in settings that don't have the resources or the technologies that high-income countries have, but may have more human capabilities at the local level. So, for example, countries like Vietnam and Cuba have performed very well during this pandemic, I think precisely because they were able to draw on a very robust network, a human network of classic bread and butter public health. Whereas the West no longer really had that network in some countries. And I think that's actually where, if there are any lessons to be drawn from these analyses, it's that you have to stop just looking at the top, at the kind of key technological performance indicators, and really look at wider network resilience.
Yes. And as an academic historian, as a researcher, do you feel confident, or do you despair that the opportunity for taking this kind of root and branch analysis in order to produce better healthcare systems? I mean, my sense is that there's going to be rebooting of healthcare systems globally because of this crisis. But my question really is in terms of the opportunity to inform policy. Do you feel that that's something that is easily achieved, or still difficult for humanities researchers to contribute in that way?
I mean, I think that recent years have seen a lot of openings at the kind of high level, decision maker level for new approaches. I've seen that happen specifically in the case of antimicrobial resistance, where previous approaches, which were too tech focused, too much focused on behaviorist interventions, etc., had just run out of steam by 2015. They hadn't changed usage patterns, they hadn't changed the antimicrobial resistance patterns. And so I think that frustration, that community opened the door for new angles of thinking. And I hope that with COVID-19, we'll see that happen too. I mean, in terms of simple kind of lessons that I guess a kind of more structural social sciences, history-based analysis can give, it's to, I think, broaden the perspective. I mean, each system clearly is the result of organic evolution that is shaped by social, political, cultural factors in each individual country. But there are some broader trends that historians have been highlighting since the 1970s, 1980s, and that's just the importance of access, which has been ignored for a very long time by international and global health establishments in terms of just improving basic access to healthcare, water, sanitation, and hygiene, rather than over prioritizing technical interventions. In the UK specifically, there's been a political tendency to overpromise on tech and actually underdeliver in terms of just basic access. And there's also the very big danger, and this is, I think, where global history can really help, of health systems that are nationally based to stop thinking outside of their borders. So people tend to stop thinking of health threats as long as they don't cross the borders into the perceived biosecure area. And that, for many diseases around the world, has caused huge problems. In my own work on typhoid,
yes,
it's a classic case sample where the disease is now considered in many high-income countries as a disease of the past, of poor countries. So you've got this unhelpful merger in people's minds of it's both alien and it's ancient, it's medieval, so it couldn't possibly hit me. And this resulted in a neglect of basic interventions, of new vaccine development, which is just starting to change. But unfortunately, it changed so late that we are now facing strains in Pakistan where the last affordable, available oral antibiotic is starting to lose its efficacy. So that's really difficult. And perhaps the very last lesson from this kind of approach is also to just appreciate the need for autonomy within public health systems. So what we've seen both in the US and the UK since the 1970s is a gradual erosion of political autonomy within the public health system, so that it's no longer very good at defending its interest within the broader medical market space. So those would be simple insights, I guess, from the
well, they're hugely interesting insights. And I feel like you are tackling global issues, in a 30-minute session. So it's really interesting, but also really challenging as well. But what you're saying really resonates. I want to move on just for a minute or two onto a topic that you've raised there around vaccine development and trials and rollouts. And I know that from your previous work, you've looked at this, and you mentioned in our conversations leading up to this session here, some observations and concerns around the potential for development and rollout of vaccines for COVID-19. So we just have a couple of minutes before we have to wrap it up. But is there something you'd like to sort of discuss with us on that vaccine rollout and development?
I mean, I think for me at the moment, that's one of the most interesting areas of research. And I think because everything's so experimental at the moment, and on the one hand side, there's a very strong tradition of historical research stressing the need for transparency, for rigorous controls, effective communication, etc. But at the same time, we're now in a situation where we will likely be rolling out technologies where the standard time for testing has been shortened to the degree that is possible while keeping things safe. So some of the research we're doing now is to just see stress test really how laws can be developed that allow for emergency licensing in a safe way, but also in a way that maintains public trust. And this extends to how we conduct clinical trials. So some of the research that we've been doing on the history of challenge trials in the context of the history of typhoid vaccination has now really come back to the relevance, with some people from Imperial College in London calling for human challenge trials, so infecting people with COVID to test vaccines. And I think the benefit from an historical perspective here is that you can highlight the maximum benefit of gain that you might get from these studies, but also highlight the risk of distrust in science and scientific ethics that may arise from this. So it's quite a rewarding time because, in a way, the gateways to halls of decision-making are pretty wide open at the moment. And I think there's a need for social sciences to signal the complexity of issues so that we don't quickly run down seemingly simple technical fixes which have long-term negative consequences.
I really like your choice of the word rewarding, because I was thinking before I spoke to you today, the thought was going through my head, given the current relevance of your work and how timely it is, I thought, on some level, are you happy? But I think rewarding is a much better way of putting it, because I'm sure there's nobody who's happy with the current crisis that we're facing. And I think it's just been so interesting, to talk to you and to listen to your historical approach and how that kind of long view of things from examples through history and across the world are so important, and that comment that you made around the insights that the historical approach can give to conversations around vaccine development that are conversations that need to be trashed out, really, really important conversations that have to be trashed out just now. And we need to come up with better insights onto those very, very important topics. So it's felt like a very quick conversation, but really, really important and really useful for me to get those insights into the way that you approach your work. So Claas, thanks very much. It's been really, really nice to talk to you.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great. I'm just going to draw attention to next week's seminar as part of this UCD Research Partners seminar series on COVID-19 and the way that the university is responding to it from multiple research perspectives. So next week, Wednesday, the 14th of October at 2 p.m. via Zoom, the next session is called Cupid COVID-19, Pediatric Emergency Department Attendance During COVID-19. So it's a shift in our direction. Dr. Emma Nicholson, a research fellow with the UCD Centre for Interdisciplinary Research, Education and Innovation in Health Systems, will be joined by Dr. Therese MacDonald, a research fellow on the project Cupid-based project within health systems in the UCD School of Nursing, Midwifery and Health Systems. So what I'm going to do is you can find a link to that on the Eventbrite page, but also on the UCD Research COVID-19 webpage. And you can link to that and other sessions leading up to Christmas and sign in to attend that session. So we're just coming up to 2:30. It's been really, really great, Claas. And again, thanks very much for your time and for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us for this session today. Thank you.